perfectly fine. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again today in our weekly workshops as the Center for Postgraduate Studies at Rhodes University. Today's workshop focuses on literature review, and joining us today is Dr. Kirstin Wilmot, who is a senior lecturer and coordinator of the Higher Education Studies doctoral program in the Center for Higher Education Research, Teaching and Learning at Rhodes University. Kirstin has a background in sociolinguistics and has conducted research dealing with issues of identity, accents, social class, language, and literacy practices. Her PhD research at the University of Sydney shifted her research focus into the sociology of higher education and the framework of a legitimation code theory, LCT. Kirstin's current research focuses on developing theoretical tools for analyzing and understanding disciplinary knowledge building practices, with a keen focus on the practice of doctoral writing and the supervision of doctoral research. Colleagues and friends, without wasting any time, allow me to introduce to you Dr. Kirstin Wilmot. Over to you, Kirstin.
Thank you so much, Asipe. I'm just going to turn my camera on very briefly just to say hi to everyone here. And thanks so much for being here this afternoon and for the invite, Asipe. All right, let me turn that off. I just want to see, I'm just having a look at the names in the list, and I recognize some from last year. The CPHS has very kindly invited me back over the years. So it's quite similar to last year, so hopefully it'll be a nice refresher, and that you won't get too bored. And I hope for the newcomers in the group this afternoon, I hope it is a useful session for you. So let me just get my screen up and running. Perfect. Asipe, if you can't see that, I'm going to rely on you to let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to assume it's all good.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Perfect. And the session is being recorded for the question in the chat. Okay. Well, welcome. And I hope that this afternoon I can help demystify some of the aspects with the literature review, and also give you a few sort of practical pointers that you can take away from this session to use in your own writing. And I just want to say from the very beginning that a literature review sounds like a fairly straightforward part of the thesis. But what we know from research and literature on literature reviews is that it's actually quite a complex writing task to do as part of the thesis. I personally found it quite challenging. And weirdly, it was the first chapter I wrote of my thesis because it was a way to read myself into the field. And it was actually the last chapter I wrote. So once everything else was finalized in the thesis, I went back to my literature review and I actually rewrote it pretty much from scratch, funnily enough. And I'm telling you this because I want to iterate to you that doctoral writing is really a bit of an iterative cyclical process, as much as we would like it to be sort of you start something and you finish it and then you're done. Sadly, it doesn't often work like that. And we often have to redo, redraft, give things another go. And then the second part of this little story before we get going is just to say as well that it's much easier to come back to a literature review once you know exactly what your contribution is going to be. And quite often we only know that by the end. And I'm hoping that this session is going to really show you why I say that, because I want to try and get you to think of the literature review in context with the rest of the thesis. So what it's doing, what it's setting up near the beginning, and how it relates to other parts of the thesis. All right. So on that note, let's get moving. So just to start off, because the literature review, it's something you hear all the time, it's something that's spoken about a lot, it's quite easy for it just to become assumed that everybody has a shared understanding of what it is and what it's supposed to do in a thesis. So I thought it might be useful just to clarify up front what it is that we are talking about when we talk about a literature review. And according to these authors, the literature review is a place where doctoral writers must situate their contribution to knowledge in the wider context of established research. Okay, I'm just going to butt into myself here. If you are sitting in the room and you're a master's student or an honors student, please don't worry. Even though I use the word doctoral and PhD, everything that I'm saying would be relevant for you as well. Okay, so it's the place where you've got to situate your contribution to knowledge. And what they mean by that is it's where you are showing your reader how your research fits into the bigger field. So you must be able to contextualize your research. The authors also say it's a place where doctoral writers demonstrate an understanding of theoretical perspectives and how these drive research design. So when you are interacting and engaging with the literature, you need to be pointing to your reader that you know what kinds of theories have been used, how these theories drive different kinds of research design, and what the affordances and limitations of those approaches provide the field. It's also a place for processes of evaluating previous studies. So there is a little bit of an evaluation aspect here, where you need to make a bit of a judgment call on what is useful and what is not useful. And that judgment comes in two ways. The first is that you will decide what literature you actually include in your writing, because not everything that you read is appropriate to include. So you're going to have to make that judgment call at that point. And then when you actually do include the other people's studies, you need to explain to your reader what they offer the field in terms of understanding your topic. And in doing these things, you are gradually, throughout the literature review, you are providing a justification for the proposed study. Okay, so your reader, by the time they've read the literature review, they should be convinced that your study is needed, that it's not just research for research's sake, but that it's actually something that the field needs because something is missing. So in that sense, if you think about a literature review in that way, it becomes much more of a summary. And a lot of people go into research, into postgraduate studies, into writing a paper, and it's quite an easy thing to slip back into, but often people think a literature review is just a summary. But what I'm going to argue today, and what I'm going to try and show you, is that a literature review is more than that. It's more than just showing what is already known in the field. So it's more than just summarizing other people's key findings. Rather, it is a place where you situate your study into that bigger picture, into the existing literature and studies that are available in the field, by crafting out some kind of research gap. Okay, so that's quite different to just writing a summary of what other people have found. And we're going to look at these 2 points in a little bit more detail so I can show you what I mean. So if we take that first one, the idea that a literature review is more than showing what is already known. So that common understanding, as I've said, is to show your reader how much you've read and to describe the field. And it's very easy and tempting, particularly as a new student, you want to show your reader and your examiner just how much work you've done, and the article upon articles upon articles that you've read, and the time that you've spent. And while that is quite tempting, it's not always appropriate to include everything you've read, because you're going to go down rabbit holes and you're going to read off topic and you're going to have to circle back. And so what we need to focus on is being quite selective in what you include, because you have to use it in a particular way. Okay, so it's more than summarizing. And today I'm going to invite you to move beyond this understanding. And to do that, we're going to try and shift the understanding from a summary to more using the space, using the literature review to show how your study fits in to what is already known in the field, to also show why it is important or needed. So it's not only to say, I'm adding this extra little bit here, but it's to convince your reader that, yes, I'm adding this new bit here because the field really needs to know about this. So in that sense, it's about building a rationale for your study. And the way you do that is you purposefully, actively, authoritatively draw on literature to convince your reader that there is actually a gap in the field. So it's no longer just a list of he said, she said. It becomes a case of this is what is known, and this is what is missing from the field. And that's the gap that I'm contributing to. Because when you shift it like that, it becomes a much more active sort of activity in the thesis rather than a very passive list-making summary of what others have done. Okay, but just to interrogate this idea of the gap, a little bit more. What's important to understand here is that gaps don't just exist. They're not out there waiting for someone to stumble upon them. You actually have to create them. And the literature review is where you create them. And you do it through your writing. And the way you do that is through clarifying what is known. So that would be the sort of common approach to literature review. So I'm not saying you just disregard that altogether. It's only part of it though. So what is known? So what have other authors found? And then you can make an argument for what is unknown, what is yet to be found out. And then you can take that a little bit further and you can argue or present an argument or make a case for why it's unknown. So why have other authors not been able to do this very particular thing that you want to do? And why is that important? Why should your reader even care? Why should they bother with your study? So you are creating this through your writing. So by the end of the literature review, your reader should understand the nature of the field. So what exists and how it and why it exists and who's responsible for that. Your reader should also have an understanding of what it is that the field needs and why. So what is missing currently from the field and why is it missing? And then by the end of this section of the thesis, they should also have an understanding of what is needed to address those needs. So what would a new study need to do in order to address that gap that you have created? And this is where I was saying at the beginning, to think of the literature review in context to other parts of your thesis. Because if you can help your reader understand the nature of the field, what the field needs and why, and what is needed, it generally creates a nice logical flow to your next chapter, which, and I'm speaking more from a higher education studies, sort of social sciencey side of things, it's most likely going to be your theory chapter that will follow. What I have found in my research, though, is obviously dissertations can look very different, but the argument I'm making here still holds. So if you can set up your literature review in this way, it's going to create a nice flow. So even if the next flow is methods, it's setting your reader up to understand your field and your topic and why that's necessary. And what's really important is that there needs to be coherence and logic between the literature review and your contribution. Because remember, if you are constructing a gap that you are arguing needs further study in your literature review, and then you're offering your new study as filling that gap, then your contribution at the end of the thesis should speak back to that gap. Because at the start, you're setting up, you're creating a gap. At the end, you should be filling that gap. So those two chapters or sections of the thesis need to sort of speak to one another. And that's why I say it might be quite a good idea that by the end of the thesis, you just go back and have a look at your literature review and just make sure that it is aligned. And in my experience, it was much easier and quicker to sort of revamp it at the end. But having that solid foundation at the beginning really helped steer me in the right direction and helped keep me on course. So that's something to hold on to as well. All right, so essentially what we are doing at postgraduate level is we are working with knowledge in a slightly different way. And what I mean by that is when we were in undergrad and perhaps maybe even honors is a transitional year, but we were generally doing a lot of knowledge telling. So that typically includes copying directly from source texts. It often involves including too many citations and representing texts with numerous and lengthy direct quotations. And this approach is often used by candidates as a way to become familiar with the genre of literature reviews. So this is a very common starting point. Actually, it would be a starting point throughout the whole spectrum of postgraduate studies. Your sort of first attempt would most likely be more of a knowledge telling exercise. And that's often because it's quite daunting to sort of jump into all this literature, which all these big names have written, and now you're supposed to draw on it and use it and evaluate it. It can be quite an overwhelming and quite daunting task. So many people often start off with knowledge telling. And what we are going to push towards today is more knowledge transformation. And knowledge transformation requires the candidate to do something a little bit more with those source texts. So what we are wanting is for the writer to take the source texts and use them in innovative ways to link ideas, concepts, arguments, and perspectives, and to promote his or her own argument. So we're trying here, like I mentioned at the beginning, to go from more of the passive summarized lists of knowledge telling, he said, she said, they said, etc. And we're shifting that over into a more active process in the writing, where we're actually using literature for our own purpose, to promote our own argument, to show links that we're making between the conversations that are happening in the field. And that's what I mean by moving from knowledge telling to more knowledge transformation. Okay, so that's been sort of the intro. And I'm sure there's at least one of you sitting in the room thinking, okay, that sounds great, but just tell us how to do it. Okay. So I'm hoping that you're still on board and that you're following, and I'm hoping that I'm starting to convince you that the literature review is more than a summary. So let's keep going, because now I want to shift gears a little bit to think about how we do this. So if you are agreeing with me that, yes, okay, it's about constructing a rationale, okay, it's about constructing a research gap, okay, it's an active process. How do we actually do that in writing? Because it's quite easy to sort of sign up for those ideas here, go back to your writing tonight, and sort of feel like you're not quite able to move away from old habits, which could be summarizing. Perhaps you're doing all this stuff already. Okay, so one part of this more active, authoritative approach to literature reviews is finding your voice. And I'm sure many of you have had feedback from supervisors who have said, I just don't hear your voice. Your voice is just not coming through. You seem absent in this text. And this whole idea of having a voice is often linked to being critical. Some people will say, you've got to, you have to have a more critical stance when you read things. You've got to be critical with the way you engage with literature. And that is often offered as a way to move beyond the summarizing. So a supervisor or someone might say, don't summarize. I don't want a summary. I want you to insert your voice and be critical. But what does that actually mean? And what we have found is students often mistake, and it's not just students, let me tell you, it's academics in general, often mistake being critical to mean critique, which is to find what is wrong. And this is problematic on two levels. The first one is that this can be really intimidating. So if you are reading renowned scholars' work in the field internationally, or perhaps you're even reading your HOD's work or your supervisor's work, and now you're supposed to critique it and show what's wrong, that can be hugely intimidating, especially if you have to hand it in to that person. It's also problematic because we don't want to bash existing research. And I have fallen into this trap myself, where I have taken criticality to mean critique. And I remember in the first draft of my literature review, my supervisor just erupted into laughter because he said, "Gosh, you're so mean." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You're just so mean to authors. You're saying this study is useless and this study is useless and this study has all these limitations." And he said, you can't do that. You can't bash other authors in the field. And so something I've taken, a comment Sue McKenna once made, she said, you need a healthy skepticism, but not to adopt cynicism. So you need to be skeptical of what you're reading. You need to be asking questions about what you're reading, but you don't have to be cynical about them and overly negative. So I found that quite a useful distinction to make. And so when we think about this whole idea of finding your voice and of developing some sort of criticality and about approaching literature with questions, not just accepting everything at face value, but rather looking a little bit deeper, we can start thinking about engaging with literature as a conversation. And you as the author are curating that conversation. You're organizing that conversation for a very particular purpose. So you're not just having it for the sake of it, but you are actually having that conversation and joining that conversation and organizing that conversation in a particular way to serve your purpose. And I'm going to use an analogy to try and draw this out a little bit more. And I've got this from Camlin Thompson, and I've got their references at the end, and it's a really useful chapter to read, actually. But they suggest that when it comes to the literature review, you imagine that you are a talk show host, so a TV type thing or a radio, or if you prefer the analogy, if you feel like a dinner party resonates more with you, that's fine. So imagine that you are one of these. Either scenario, you are in control. You are the host, right? And your job as host is to direct the conversation between the guests around talking points. And your guests in this case are the other authors, the other existing studies, and your talking points are around the assumptions and aspects related to those studies in relation to your topic. All right. Your job then, as host, is to look for connections between ideas and authors. Because if you can picture having 2 people or 3 people in your studio or around your dinner table, maybe let's push it up to 8 people, you've got to look for links. If you're a really good host, you're going to think to yourself, what does person A have in common with person C? What would they have to talk about? Let me try and find the links. And in doing that, you are curating or organizing that conversation to unfold in a particular way. And you're doing that in order to show up where the gap is and to establish that gap. And you're going to use different authors, different ideas, different links in that conversation to convince your reader that that gap A exists and B is relevant and important to fill. And we need to remember that assumptions and claims are always open to doubt. That's the nature of academic writing. That's our job as academics, is we create and construct a series of claims and arguments, and we provide evidence for them. And the idea is we want to convince our reader that we are right. The whole notion of truth in academia is very contested, as you all know. There is no one truth. So we are constantly arguing generating claims, backing it up with evidence in order to convince people. All right. And that's what this conversation is going to be doing. So you need to work with the literature until you have convinced your reader, until you have created a strong argument. But you can imagine, and I'm sure we've all been there, when dinner parties or talk show hosts go miserably wrong, and you just like, if you're listening on the radio, you just want to cringe, or if you're sitting around a table or perhaps even hosting and things are just not going well. I think we can all kind of relate to one of those awkward, cringeworthy situations. But let's have a look at some. We've got some examples here. So we might end up, I'm going to just go with the analogy of a dinner party here. So we could end up at a really dull dinner party. So you can imagine this is where the researcher or the author gets her guests to speak one after the other. So you go around the table saying, okay, you have a turn, then you have a turn, then you have a turn, then you have a turn. I mean, it's boring just talking about it. And if there's no engagement and there's no interaction, there's no butting in, there's no saying, oh, this idea links with your idea, which links to that other person's idea. If it's just literally you go, you go, you go, you go, it's really dull, okay? If you write that way in your thesis, it's going to be really dull for your reader. And it's not going to contribute into a rich, convincing argument. You can also have a really awkward dinner party where the host or the researcher holds the floor, ridicules all the guests, and prevents them from talking back or to each other. And that would be the perfect description of what I did in my first draft of my literature review, where I was just like, this paper's bad, this paper's bad, this one's useless, this one doesn't do that, this one can't even get to that because it hasn't done X, Y, and Z. That's really awkward. So we don't want too much critical voice. We don't want too much critique from the writer, because that's just a bit awkward. And again, it's very hard to make convincing arguments when that happens. And then, of course, there's a situation which is very, very common when the host becomes invisible. And that's when the guests, or going back to writing, when the literature just takes over and the host or the researcher just becomes invisible. And that's often when your supervisor says, you know, where's your voice here? I can't see the argument. I can't see where this is going. Why are you including this? All of those comments are probably indicating to some sort of absence of you in that text and an absence of you controlling the conversation. Okay, so we know when things go wrong. Again, though, we can read this, we can talk about this, and we can understand it. But again, I find it really useful to actually see examples of good texts and not so good texts, so you can actually start seeing the difference in the writing. And that's what I want to ask you to do next, is to read this example. And as I said, this comes from a paper. You can access the chapter in your own time. But I just want to give you 2 minutes or 1 minute just to read through this text, and then we can have a look at what's going on here. Okay, if you haven't finished, don't worry. I just wanted you to get a sort of a sense of this text. And I'm wondering if anyone wants to open up the chat and just quickly write some thoughts there. What do you think is happening here? Thinking about the dinner parties, do you think this little extract has been written well? Do you think the author is present? Do you think the author is absent? Do you think is it a dull dinner party? Is it awkward? What do you make of this text? Let's just get some ideas shared in the chat. Okay. Author absent, difficult to follow. Author absent. I think the guests have taken over. Okay, author absent. Not respecting, dense, lengthy, wordy. Everyone talking at once. Okay. Okay, researcher not involved. Okay, that's fantastic. So let's have a look. And just to say up front as well, I mean, obviously doing a workshop like this, it's quite difficult because there are a whole lot of different disciplines in the room. And the texts I'm drawing on are from obviously particular disciplines. But just say it will differ slightly compared, whether you're writing in higher education studies to environmental science to English literature studies. But the principles are kind of are there. So hopefully you'll be able to take the lessons here and think about how they relate to your discipline. Okay, so Kamler and Thompson would describe this as an example of crowding your writing with the literature. And I think many of your comments really captured that. It's kind of overwhelming. It's just like so many people talking at once. It's chaotic. It's very hard to follow because with all the voices coming in, it's quite hard to follow what the point is or what the argument is or what the meaning is that this author is wanting to construct here. Yeah, as Linda said, she didn't even get to the end because she was trying to untangle. It feels like a bit of spaghetti that's all tangled up. So that's quite a nice example of just completely overcrowding and overwhelming your reader. Let's have a look at a different one. So again, I'm going to give you a minute and then let's share some thoughts about this one. And when you're ready, you can start popping things into the chat. Okay, so Martha's saying literature is more paraphrased here and perhaps it's better than example one. Others are saying writer's voice is missing, is absent. Very passive. The researcher hasn't joined the conversation. Okay. The author's just restating what has been said. Okay, we don't know what the gap is or what the writer actually thinks. Okay. Okay, so the guests are starting to communicate, but the host is a bit absent. All right. Obviously, just to say as well that when you take snippets like this to use in a session like this, it is a bit unfair. I'm being a bit unfair on these authors, but because you just sort of taking a little bit out of context. But nevertheless, I think they do help show what this could look like. So I think you are absolutely right here. Although there's a bit of flow, it's not so overwhelming as example one. It's sort of a calmer experience of reading. It is quite passive and a little bit it just sort of captures what other people were saying. And as somebody said, you don't get a sense of what the author believes. So Kamler and Thompson described this example as the invisible scholar. And I think that would be a fair sort of assessment of that. Okay, so if we stand back then from those two texts, in both of these examples, the candidates are not using literature to locate their studies. So they're not saying how they sort of fit in to the rest of the field. And they're not really using literature to advance an argument about the state of the field and then also where their study would fit in. So they, in different ways, one being so overwhelming, the other one being quite boring and passive, but neither of them are actually doing the job that the literature review should be doing. But this is quite a common starting point. And it's quite often happens when scholars lack a bit of confidence and authority and are overwhelmed by the work of others. So perhaps you could identify with that sort of feeling, like you can't touch other studies, you can't have any sort of opinion of them because they are sort of untouchable, because maybe they're top scholars. Or you might have the exact opposite like I had, and you just think that you're that you can just lambaste everyone. But this is the more common reaction. And so to think about, do you think you are an overcrowder? Do you just throw in so many references because you just want to show your reader just how much reading you've done and who you're citing and the big names? Do you think you overwhelm your reader? Or are you perhaps erring on the side of being a bit absent, of just kind of presenting a he said, she said, and not really inserting yourself in that text? And this whole idea of inserting yourself and of having a voice, and the scholarly voice, the doctoral voice you hear of often, is quite difficult, because it's not saying, well, I think X, Y, and Z. It's not about inserting yourself into the text with using like I said this and I think that. It's more about the voice is more about control over the way that you use literature. So I think of voice a lot more in terms of how in control is the author over the conversation. And that's how I sort of gauge scholarly voice. And I'm going to show you an example here coming next. And I want you to think about I would just like to see your impressions of this example compared to the other examples. So this is not taken from that reading. It's another one I found, but I want to give you a minute or so. Read this one and pop your thoughts in the chat about what you make of it. And when you're ready, you can start putting some thoughts down in the chat. What do you make of this in comparison to those first two? James, I see your comment. Yes. This is a paper from environmental science at Rhodes. But it's always good to open our own work up for debate. All right, let's see what some people are saying. Flows well, provides good justification of the study, and the references are used to give weight to the argument. Coherent and logical, but at the same time links different authors who build up on each other. The writing is more interesting. This host seems to understand the guest's point of view and is able to share the impact and relevance of what the guests are saying. Renuka, that's my supervisor there, no comment. All right, you can sit this one out. Identifiable gap, coherence, a story is starting to build. All right, so I recently actually did a workshop for environmental science students, which is why I thought, let me find something that they will actually relate to. And so I was looking for some good examples. And while I think that there's no perfect piece of writing, I chose this one because I think I agree with all of your comments that there seems to be a calmness and a sort of authority in the way that this is written, but at the same time, let me try and get my words right here. There's a calmness and a logic, and you can follow it, but it's quite confident. I got a sense that the authors here were very much in control of the literature and what they wanted to do with that literature. So they really made this literature work for them. And that's the kind of the thing that you should be aiming for in your literature review. It's to draw on those guests around your table, around your talk show host. It's to draw on those guests or those literatures to do something specific for you. It's not random, and it's not passive. You're not just listing things. You're actually using them to contextualize your study and to create a gap and to make your reader see why that gap is there. So I'm very glad that we were on the same page there. And for those of you who work with some of these people, you can go back and tell them that that everyone agreed that it was a good piece of writing. Okay, so I think we'll move on from here, but I'm hoping, and from your answers, I'm getting a sense that the room is following me when in showing how this one differs. It has a different feel and flow to the others, and this is kind of what we should be aiming for. Okay, so now that we've seen these examples, and I've called this one being in charge of the literature. What can we do to try and get there, to try and write like those authors in example 3? So what can we do to cultivate this idea of having a critical voice, of having a scholarly voice? And my suggestion today is that you start asking your literature some questions. When you read a paper, we normally read and sort of quickly go to the findings, because that's sort of the meat of the paper. I'm going to challenge you to ask other questions of your literature, because it will help you to critically evaluate the literature, and it will help you create links between different similar and different studies, and to start identifying limitations. And that is where that criticality is going to come in. So what do I actually mean? Okay. So when you read a paper, first of all, you should always have a reading journal next to you. So for every little bit of reading you do, you should be doing writing alongside it, because that's how you start to make sense of what you're reading. And it's how you start to create links to other papers. Otherwise, you'll forget. You really mean not to forget, but you do. Trust me. So for every bit of reading, do a bit of writing. And these are the questions that can be used as prompts for your writing. Okay, so the obvious one. When you read a paper, what are the findings? What are the authors arguing? What are they concluding? And what are the implications for what they are saying? Okay, so you can do a little 2-minute free writing task where you set a timer and you write down as much as you can about what came out of this paper. What did these authors find? What are they contributing to the field? Okay, that's the obvious one. I'm sure we all do that in any case. But some less obvious ones. I'm going to encourage you to start paying attention to the methods and the data that your literature is using. Are they quantitative studies? Are they qualitative? If they're quantitative, how big? Are they longitudinal? Are they snapshots? Are they surveys? What are they using? If it's documentary analysis, what is that? How big of a corpus are they using? Did they do interviews? How many? Who did they interview? Over what period of time? Start looking at what is informing the findings and start asking yourself, how did they get to those findings? So what enabled those researchers to come up with the findings that they came up with? Okay, how did they do the studies? So you can start making notes about that. You can also start making notes about the fields that this research and the findings are coming from and the theories. So for example, when I say field, what discipline, my PhD was on doctoral writing, and I was working in the sociology of higher education because I was looking at knowledge. But most of the literature that I had to go and read was from linguistics, because it just so happened that linguists were more interested in my topic previously than sociologists. So I had to sort of put a foot in each field to say, what are the sociologists of education saying about knowledge, and what are the linguists saying about writing, and bring those together. So that's something useful to watch out for, especially if you're in transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary fields. Where is that knowledge being produced? And does it have any implications? Okay, you can be making notes about that. You can also be making notes about what theories are being used. So what analytical tools are being used, what frameworks are being used, what models are being used, and what do those frameworks or models lend themselves to? So what kinds of findings are they able to produce? And you can write that down, but also keep in mind, what are they not producing? So what are they not seeing? And you can ask questions around that. Another one, what kind of a study is it? Is it an academic study? Are they using empirical data? Is it a more conceptual study? A more theoretical paper where authors are advancing a theoretical idea or conceptual idea? Is it a meta study? Is it more of a commentary? Are you using literature that's sort of non-academic mainstream, commentary material, newspapers, news articles? So to sort of, scholars would call this grey literature. You know, what are you drawing on? And again, what are the implications for that? How trustworthy are the claims? How generalizable are those claims? And you can be looking at what questions research is asking. What are they going into those studies wanting to find out? And again, what does that, what are the implications of those? Because if you start asking these sorts of questions of your literature for every paper that you read, you can then do two key things that helps you build a case. The first one is, what is good about this? What is really positive about what's already on offer in the field, in existing studies? So what is really good about a study that you're looking at? What does it offer? How does it extend our knowledge about this topic area? What are the advantages to its theory or method or data? So if you happen to pick a topic, read a study and it's using, I'll take one from my field because it's more familiar. If you're using Margaret Archer's social realism, what is it about that framework, that theoretical framework? What does that allow you to see that you otherwise wouldn't be able to see? So what does it offer the field that other studies can't offer? But and you can make notes of that, right? Because you're going to have to know what it can do in order to situate your study within that. On the flip side then, what are the limitations? So if we go back to the example, if you're using social realism, what can it not see that perhaps another approach or another theoretical framework might offer? So are there limitations? And what are the limitations of that study in terms of offering the field a sort of in-depth knowledge on your topic? Because essentially by asking these questions, getting the positives and the limitations, the positives allow you to kind of remain modest in your writing, but to also build on other people. So you're not just dismissing past research, you're saying, hey, look, reader, all of this other past research exists, and it's super useful because it's showing us this and it's showing us that, and because they've used this data, it gives us student perceptions on this. But, okay, that's really great, but they haven't been able to look at the nature of knowledge, or they haven't been able to get, they've done this study on why students don't go to lectures, and they've interviewed the students, and they've done this amazing qualitative study, and it's rich in their narratives and their life stories. And you can say, okay, that's so useful because it's fleshing out this topic, it's giving a human sort of element to it. But what they didn't do is, this past studies haven't taken into account the structures of the university and how those structures impact students going to lectures or not. And so maybe besides interviewing students, we need to start interviewing stakeholders in the universities, like management, to see how the structures work. So that is how you start to say, okay, yes, there is all this knowledge out there, but there's something missing. And then it's not you just saying, oh, by the way, it's missing, because no one's going to believe you. You're going to show your reader what's missing, and you're going to show them by saying, this is what's known, this is how it came to be known, but this is what's missing from existing research. And that's a much harder argument to sort of push away as a reader, because you're actually using the literature as evidence for creating that gap. Okay. So I want to just consider an example to show you what I mean here. An example of how these questions can help you engage with literature. Okay, so here's an example from my field, and then I'll show you another one from environmental science to see the differences. So I'm going to give you a few moments just to read this, and then we will go through it together in terms of the questions. Okay, I'm hoping you've managed to read most of it. So the next slide, I'm going to highlight different parts of the same text, and I want to show you how different those different questions that I've encouraged you to use sort of come through in this text. Okay, so let's move on. So you can see here, the author starts, and it's highlighted here in yellow. Oopsie. And I'm hoping that not too many people in the room are going to be affected by color blindness, but it's essentially the first two sentences up to the end of in the workplace. So that first chunk of text that I've highlighted in yellow, you can see how the author is characterizing the kinds of research on quite a broad level. So she's saying that, well, they're saying that not much research has been reported, and that which has been included has used mostly quantitative approaches. Okay, and then she's given some examples in the brackets there. So she's broadly categorized it in terms of its methodological approach. Okay. Then they say this research conducted in the Netherlands, USA, Australia, New Zealand. That part there is still sort of characterizing it in terms of where it's being done. Okay. And what the sort of aims of that research were. Okay, so again, it's working at a very sort of broad level, characterizing a lot of studies in one go. It's talking about a body of literature here. Okay, so that's a way that you can also give your reader a sense of the field more generally without having to explicitly mention every single study that you've read. You can take every single study that you've read and step away from it and start thinking about how would I characterize this more generally? And what you'll probably start finding is that you can sort of lump some literatures together and others in a different pile and others in a different pile according to their characteristics, how they were done, the theoretical frameworks that were used, perhaps there's similarities there. Perhaps you want to clump them together into geographical location, maybe that holds significance. But to be able to sort of stand back and start talking about the literature or groups of literature rather than very particular individual studies is quite a powerful sort of stance in the literature review, because it's, as I say, it's giving your reader a sense that you know the terrain, you know what's out there to such an extent that you can say, you know, these kinds of studies do these kinds of things. And that's quite a powerful way of including more of what you've read than having to work through every single study individually, which can get a bit boring. Okay, but you can't just leave it there because your reader needs to be convinced. And so you'll see here in the green, the authors then give the reader a sort of taste of what these studies offer the field. So what has come out of these studies, the findings that have come out of these studies. And again, they're keeping it quite broad. Findings from these studies are remarkably consistent, and then they give some details. Okay, and you'll see there that there isn't a reference because they are giving you a taste of the studies that have been referenced before. Okay, so it's on a very broad level here still. Then what they do is they start to think about what are the limitations of these kinds of studies. And they actually draw on a particular paper here to make that claim even stronger. So it's not just them thinking this, it's also other authors in the field. And they specifically say that these authors noted limitations of quantitative data. So they've characterized that most of the literature available is quantitative. They've given a little snapshot of what that can offer the field, but then they're saying, look, while it offers all of this good stuff, it's actually, there are limitations because they're only getting half of the picture or a slice of the picture. Okay. They then they characterize a little bit more, and they're saying, you know, in more recent years, more quantitative studies have been done, but so have qualitative studies. But again, already they are inserting a bit of a limitation here. They're saying, you know, more research has been done, but not really in the area of in science and humanities and social sciences from more than one country. So we can immediately get a sense here that when we look at these two limitations highlighted in pink, they are pointing to the fact that quantitative data is limited. So that should already signal they're probably going to offer a qualitative study. And when they go on to say that the literature hasn't really considered PhD graduates from more than one country, that should also start pinging the reader to think, okay, so they probably are crafting a gap that they need more qualitative research and they need cross-country comparisons. And then the authors provide an example of one such study that does exist. And they move swiftly on to show what that kind of a study afforded the field. So not only are they characterizing the literature more broadly, pointing out a limitation in terms of what kind of research it is, they're then saying what's needed is more of this kind of study. Oh, and just by the way, someone's actually done one piece of research on it, and these are the kinds of things it can offer the field. So what we can see here is these authors are very skillfully using literature to build a particular gap. They are crafting out a particular gap using the literature to do so and to add the evidence along the way. So this, I'm sure you will agree, is very different to example 1 and 2, those problematic examples we looked at. The authors are very much in control. And what I'm hoping that you're starting to see with this color coding is this movement in the writing between characterizing, perhaps offering an example of what it looks like, showing your reader what they were able to offer the field, and then also pointing to the limitations, which will essentially build into the gap that the authors are wanting to make. Okay. I think I'm going to push on to one more example, unless, are there any questions at this point? Or should we push to the next example and then wrap up and then open up for questions? What would you prefer?
Please wrap up and push to the next section and wrap up if you can. Thanks, Kirstin.
Okay. All right. So do you want the example, James, or should we just skip that one? Another example. Okay.
Please, another example.
Okay, perfect. All right. I'm going to give you a few minutes to read this one, and then we'll go through it again. Okay, just in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. If you haven't finished reading, don't worry. You can sort of read along in the next slide, or you can go back to this when you get the slides. I will make them available. Okay, so let's have a look here. This extract is a little bit more dense. It's a little bit more hard work at the beginning. but I think it still is quite useful to think about in terms of keeping those questions in the back of your mind. So once again, totally different authors, different discipline. But what we can see here is these authors have also characterized a body of literature on a more general level, looking at the methods, the approach, theories, geographic distribution, and so forth. So they say that environmental stewardship has been studied in numerous different contexts, including forests, and they provide evidence for that, freshwater evidence, grasslands and rangelands, evidence in the citations, rural agriculture, landscapes, urban environments, and coastal marine habitats. Okay, so we get a sense of this body of literature in general. They then give the reader a sense of what has come out of these studies and what they offer to the field. So they're highlighted in green. These studies tend to focus the analysis either on a subset of the different factors that can support. All right, so keeping it quite general, still giving the reader a sense of what they offer the field, the positives. And then they go into the limitations quite explicitly. So they say few of these papers provide definitions of stewardship. Okay, so that should be a ping to the reader that they are pointing to the fact that they don't provide definitions of stewardship, which could mean that the gap, we would have to read more, but it's likely that they are pointing to a gap in that these papers don't provide definitions. So perhaps this new one is going to do just that. And they say they do not focus either on the ethical dimension or simply on stewardship as behaviors or actions. Okay, here we go. To our knowledge, there are no academic studies that provide a comprehensive definition and integrative analytical framework to bring together the different elements. So in pointing out a limitation, the authors are actually at the same time crafting out that gap that they're going to fill. And then what's interesting is what's highlighted in green towards the end, they're saying, however, there are many existing frameworks for related concepts. And then they list some and they provide evidence. And they say, which can inform such an effort. All right, and then they say, in particular, these frameworks provide useful ways of thinking. So what they are doing is they are pointing out a gap. They're saying this is missing in the field, but they are actually quite cleverly also showing the reader this is not, this is not so left field that it's missing because nobody cares and nobody should care. By showing that there are existing frameworks that can be used as like a starting point, they're actually providing a more convincing argument that what they want to do is worthwhile. Because they're not saying, this knowledge is missing, and leaving it for the reader to make that decision of whether that's necessary or not to fill that gap. They're actually saying, look, there is a gap. And what we can take away from other literature is that there are all these useful building blocks that we can then use as a starting point in filling that gap. So they actually are building on other studies in a way to show their reader how they're going to go about this, which again is quite an interesting and quite a powerful argument and use of literature in creating a convincing argument for that gap. So that was just another example, and you can definitely work through that. All right, so we're not going to do the free writing task, but I encourage you to do this in your own time. And if you haven't done free writing before, free writing is a short burst of writing, no more than 7 minutes. I normally work to about 4 to 5 minutes. Set your timer on your phone, turn your phone over so you can't see it. And pen and paper is actually best, but if you want to use a keyboard, that's fine, on a computer. And the idea is you just write as much as you can and you don't stop for those 5 minutes or 4 minutes. And it's kind of like a mind dump where you just dump your thoughts on a page as quickly as you can for that time limit. But I really encourage you to start doing this when you are reading your literature. So just as a recap, developing a critical voice, it's not about just praising and demolishing the work of others. It's about making a number of judgments and decisions about which literatures to engage with, which to ignore, which to stress and which to downplay. And it also means paying attention to what's going on in those studies. What are the assumptions? How were they done? What were the findings? What were the questions? And that's where that set of questions I've posed to you can be really useful. And at the end of the day, it's also about being respectful. It's about building the field rather than trashing the field, as I quickly learned myself. And by looking at both the positives of what the literature offers and the limitations, you're able to create that balance and show the respect as well. And just to say that there's no one size fits all. There are going to be very different kinds of gaps that you can create in your research. Here are a couple. There are no doubt many more. You can argue no one's ever tackled the problem before. You can argue that you're offering a new aspect of the problem by using different kinds of data. Perhaps who you are as a person has given you legitimacy to understand a topic in a particular way that would be more common in the humanities, sort of African studies, cultural studies, where really who you are as a person comes to the fore very strongly. In the social sciences, that wouldn't really be the case. So these are things you can pay attention to, chat to your supervisor about, chat to your colleagues, and think about what kind of gap. All right, so literature review is where you are establishing a rationale, and you do that through constructing a kind of a gap. And you construct that gap by showing what is known, how it came to be known, what is missing, why it is missing, and ultimately, why should we even care? Why is it important that we know about this? And that's where you position your study. And then, as I said at the beginning, keep in mind that your conclusion will speak back to your literature review when you get to the very end of your thesis, which hopefully for many of you will be soon, and you'll be crossing that stage. All right, so references are there. You can follow up on anything you need. I'll work with a CPA to circulate these slides to you. And I'm going to stop there and just ask for the last 10 minutes if they have any questions or anything that you want to raise. Very happy to take some questions. Good. Thank you so much for all the comments in the chat. It's such a pleasure, everyone. Yes, I think this recording will be emailed. I think that's pretty standard. James is saying I identified gaps in my literature review. That's good. I'm glad it's been useful, James. Thank you so much for attending. It's always wonderful to have some supervisors in the room. Fantastic, everyone. Well, thank you so much for being here. These workshops and sessions only work with good people in the room, and you are the good people. So thank you for showing up and for participating and for listening. I know it makes for quite a long day ending at 5:30, but yeah, I'm sure the recording and slides will make their way to you, and just good luck with the research and wish you all the best. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Asipe.
Thank you very much, Kirstin, and thank you very much, everyone. Yes, the recording will be available. Do have a wonderful evening further. Thank you so much, Kirstin, for this presentation.
It's such a pleasure.